Hello, 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 everyone. This is Mr. Vanderpool. Today we're going to go ahead and talk about the loanable funds market, which basically takes a look at the interaction between borrowers and savers, and how this interaction between borrowers and savers sets the real interest rate in an economy. So the loanable funds market is the market where borrowers and savers exchange quantities of loanable funds, okay, QLF, at a real interest rate, our percentage. So there's two sides of this loanable funds market. There is the demand for loanable funds, and then there is the supply of loanable funds. So let's start off with the demand for loanable funds. So the demand for loanable funds, which comes from borrowing affects the demand for loanable funds. It's important to remember. Comes from households, firms, government, and the foreign sector. These entities have spent more than their income. They need to borrow. Therefore, they are the demand for loanable funds. So borrowing affects the demand for loanable funds. People that need money, need a loan, are looking to borrow, are the demand for loanable funds. The supply of loanable funds, or savings, comes from households, firms, government, and the foreign sector. So it's important to note that saving affects the supply of loanable funds. These entities have saved. Okay, you can't lend without saving first. You need to have money to lend. Okay, so saving affects the supply of loanable funds. So once again, very important to remember, borrowers are the demand of loanable funds. Savers are the supply of loanable funds. So let's say Mr. Vanderpool decides he needs a loan. So he goes to a bank to try and get the loan. So is Mr. Vanderpool the demand or the supply of loanable funds? The answer is Mr. Vanderpool is the demand for loanable funds because he is the borrower. The bank, because it has saved and can lend me money, is the supply of loanable funds because it is the saver. So now we're going to take a look at this loanable funds market in equilibrium. So on our y-axis, we're going to have the real interest rate. On our x-axis, we're going to have the quantity of loanable funds. We have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds, which will be represented by DLF. We have an upward sloping supply of loanable funds, which will be represented by SLF. And where they intersect, you have an equilibrium real interest rate, which is a lowercase r there, and then an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, which will be represented by that lowercase q. So let's focus in on the demand for loanable funds. So we're going to look at changes in the demand for loanable funds. So let's remember that demand for loanable funds is equal to borrowing. Okay, borrowers are, and borrowing is the demand for loanable funds. Borrowing affects the demand for loanable funds. So more borrowing is going to mean more demand for loanable funds, causing the demand for loanable funds to shift to the right. Less borrowing is going to mean less demand for loanable funds, which is going to shift demand for loanable funds to the left. So for example, let's say the government is deficit spending. If the government is deficit spending, that means it is borrowing to spend. So if the government is deficit spending, there is going to be more borrowing because the government is doing the borrowing in order to spend. That means more demand for loanable funds. The demand for loanable funds shifts to the right, which implies those three dots, remember, mean implies. that your real interest rate is going to go up, as we'll see on our loanable funds graph in a moment. If there's less investment demand, that means there's going to be less borrowing, which means you have less demand for loanable funds, which implies that your demand for loanable funds shifts to the left, which implies that your real interest rate is going to go down, as we'll see on our graph in a moment. Okay, so with that less investment demand there, you have people who are not borrowing to invest. Thus, you have less investment demand. So once again, the variable that shifts the demand for loanable funds is going to be borrowing. Borrowing affects the demand for loanable funds. So that the borrowing is the determinant of the demand for loanable funds, if you will. So let's take a look at shifting demands for loanable funds. So an increase in demand for loanable funds is going to look like this. You start off with loanable funds market in equilibrium, real interest rate on our y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis, downward sloping demand for loanable funds, upward sloping supply of loanable funds. Then we have an equilibrium, real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds. An increase in demand for loanable funds is going to shift the demand for loanable funds to the right from DLF to DLF1. So you can see the real interest rate went up and the quantity of loanable funds also went up after that increase in demand for loanable funds. Be sure you take down all parts of the graph. Remember, detailed graphs is absolutely essential. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at a decrease in demand for loanable funds. So once again, we have the real interest rate on our y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on our x-axis. We have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds and upward sloping supply of loanable funds. Where those two intersect, you have an equilibrium real interest rate represented by the lowercase r, and an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds represented by the lowercase q. So now we're going to have a decrease in demand for loanable funds. So the demand for loanable funds is going to shift to the left. From DLF to DLF1, where that DLF1 meets SLF, you're going to have a new equilibrium real interest rate, which has gone down to R1, and you're going to have an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, which has gone from Q to Q1. Okay, so demand for some loanable funds is shifted to the left, which has pushed down the real interest rate. It's also pushed down the quantity of loanable funds. All right, now we're going to go ahead and do a practice problem here. So we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds if there is an increase in investment demand.